Google has directed the flow of web traffic for decades. In the process, it's helped its parent company, Alphabet, become one of the most valuable businesses on the planet.
Google has accumulated unprecedented power over communication and information online.
And the worry is that because Google uses its dominance in one area to succeed in another, it's not a level playing field.
And that is really the core reason why we have seen these different lawsuits emerge over the last couple of years.
Yeah, so this seems to be kind of touching on the fact that they're doing this antitrust segment for Google and how effectively Google is becoming a monopoly. There's so many areas in which this is true. There's search, which they try to keep people there as much as humanly possible, and how most folks actually interact with the internet goes through like a Google search page. There's also YouTube, which we're on right now, which also gets a good amount of traffic. And then they also have things like Android, which then kind of build on top of these, where you could have an operating system or even a physical device that has their operating system on it, which then uses their app store or their browser or their search functionality or all of the above. And then it's going to be hard for somebody else to get in there because Google is not incentivized to promote Bing or some other app stores or anything like that. And in some cases, Google and Apple have actually practically prohibited competition in some of these areas by like preventing other app stores from existing on the markets, by default having their app stores being the ones that are installed. And so this is also something that happened with like Microsoft back in the day, where they would have the Windows operating system and then they would default have their own applications on it. And then it would just keep building into the point where basically there was no reason for anyone else to use any other software because that was the software that was there. And this stifled competition. And so this is definitely something we are seeing with Google right now. I think Google has been kind of towing this line for quite some time. And I think generally speaking, as Google and other big companies kind of encounter these scenarios, they try to find ways to sort of wiggle around this. But it's certainly true today. I know being in the tech industry, probably one of the worst things that could happen to a company is to hear that Google is going to enter that space. And Google can just completely crush industries and other companies just by them joining that area. The opposite is also true, which is you could make or break your company if Google is interested in your idea and decides to acquire you. But there's so many stories of Google entering a space, completely decimating competition because they can just link to it from their search, from their apps, from their systems. And there's no way for you to compete against them being potentially a new incumbent in the space, even if it's an area, maybe even it's a greenfield area and Google wasn't there before and they're actually just mimicking the success that they've already seen and they can just completely overtake folks who have been in there. And so definitely curious to see how this is progressing, but I do think this is going to be a big case for technology and also how they handle companies in this scenario going forward.
The U.S. government is approaching year 5 of its sprawling investigation into Google.
I think it's quite possible that what we see come out of at least one of these cases is a breakup of Google.
Many of the biggest firms in tech drew antitrust scrutiny in the late 2010s, but Google, so far, is the only company to end up in federal court. Will the U.S. government break up Google? And if so, how will that impact investors and the public? The government's first major antitrust case against Google began in October 2020. It focused on Google Search.
Search and advertising is Google's bread and butter. It has its moonshot projects, but search and advertising pays for all of that.
People who use Google Search don't pay with money. Instead, Google makes money by collecting user data and selling ads.
When we use Google as a search engine, we expose ourselves to extensive surveillance. We enable Google to use information that Google derives from our queries for personalized advertising. That's at least under the default settings.
The government's complaints focused on agreements Google made with companies like Apple.
What Google had done over the course of the past decade and a half is entered into these exclusive default agreements with other competitors, potential competitors like Apple. They entered into an agreement worth about $20 billion per year now that makes Google the exclusive search engine on all Apple devices in the Apple Safari browser. They maintained those agreements with mobile device manufacturers. If you get a phone that's made by Samsung, it has an exclusive revenue share agreement with Google so that Google Search is the only search engine that appears on that cell phone when you start it up.
The regulators believe that Google is able to keep that dominance in part because of these sweetheart deals.
For example, some Apple executives expressed interest in using the privacy-focused search engine DuckDuckGo as the default option while in private browsing mode. But the terms of their agreement with Google prevented that idea from taking root.
Google's made it very difficult to adopt DuckDuckGo. Like on Android, it's 15 to 20 steps to make DuckDuckGo the search default there.
Search engines are built with software that can crawl and rank websites on the internet. The process can cost billions of dollars if done at a scale to compete with Google. Google controls about 88% of the search engine market in the United States.
Nobody.
Yeah, so just going to pause there for a moment. That is how big they are. 88% in any market is such a rare occurrence that, as you can see here, like these are proportional. And so obviously no other segment even takes up 10% on its own. And so this is where that is such a pervasive technology that it gets harder and harder. And likely, as you can even see on this trend here, it was closer to 80% about a decade ago, and now it's nearing 90%. And so this is where it's going to eventually snowball to the point where it's likely going to cross this 90% threshold within the next decade, because unless somebody stops them, because they have all these agreements, it's easier to build upon itself. And the more things they integrate with it, the harder it is for other folks to be able to inject themselves. They also kind of highlighted DuckDuckGo there as an example, and how there's 15 clicks that are necessary in order to change that default setting. Again, from technology experience and working for things like marketplaces, etc., clicks are huge. Clicks are a hurdle to consumers and customers. And so in a standard like payment flow, something that you're looking for making the most streamlined humanly possible, you're usually looking for like 2 clicks, give or take, maybe 3 from like your cart to get to actual payment. So you're trying to streamline as much as humanly possible. And this is where, like, if you remove a click, like in that payment flow example, if you went from like 3 clicks to 2 clicks to make your transaction, you'd likely increase the amount of transactions you make, probably easily like 20% or more, just because then you reduce as much friction as humanly possible here. So something like 15 clicks, that might not necessarily resonate with everybody, but that's a huge onerous task. There's practically no system today that you would interact with in 15 clicks. Like if you think about how many clicks does it take you to open up your phone and go to Google and search for something? We could even count 1 to open up your device. We can count the second one to open up the browser. Let's go with a third one for entering into like the search bar or something like that. And then maybe a 5th one to hit go. And so that's only 5. To get to 15 is such an onerous segment that most systems you would interact with would not be nearly as onerous as that in practically any other technology space that you're in. So that is actually a prohibitive segment that would be known to all folks in technology, that the more you can hide something or the more you can push it out of the way, the less likely it is for someone to interact with it at all, and the less likely they're going to actually follow through with making those changes.
Can enter this market and credibly compete with Google.
The Google search trial included depositions from high-profile witnesses like Microsoft chief executive Satya Nadella. The presiding federal judge, Amit Mehta, determined that Google, quote, is a monopolist and has acted as one to maintain its monopoly.
Throughout that trial, we were hearing so many people talk about how Google search has gotten so much worse over the past decade.
Google does not, when it comes to local search, show the information it determines is the best. It simply self-preferences its own inferior content.
Yeah, so this is something that, again, being in tech, classically seen in the last decade, which is what they're referencing is as time has gone on, Google is incentivized to potentially put other things at the top of your list than necessarily the best content, even if it knows what you might be looking for. And examples of this classically are like ads or promotions. And so this used to be something where I believe back in the day, they might have had like a single line for advertisements. And I'm fairly certain nowadays it's like 3 or 4 promotions before you get to the actual content. And then they start to introduce other categories as well. So you might have seen this in a variety of areas. So I think the most prevalent one nowadays is like the Ask AI portion, which is it will try to use AI to give you the answer to your query from websites that it is indexed and the content that it is indexed. And so maybe they'll grab a snippet from a page and then it'll just show you in the Google search page with the results. And this is actually to deter you from going to those pages and leaving Google search, because Google is also technically competing with the websites that are indexed on it. And so it will actually try to keep you on its page instead of actually going to the other pages, because that's worse for Google. If you leave their page, you're not seeing their advertisements, they're not making money, and then they're basically passing that revenue on to others. And so now it's very common to see like this Ask AI segment. It'll put in a prompt that is pulled from a website who actually had the information and put that online. Then maybe like 3 or 4 advertisement placements for promoted segments. So like websites that are paying Google for advertisement to be promoted on those search terms. And then maybe another segment where they have like similar questions or what other people have searched for. And then they'll even show the most relevant content that they have deemed. And again, I was just talking about the number of clicks that exist. This same thing holds true for scrolling. So again, as much friction as possible exists for a user, the less likely they are to interact with it. So if you need to scroll down, and I know especially on mobile, this is very noticeable, where to get to the actual contents that are not promotion or Google's content, you sometimes have to scroll like 2 or 3 pages down to get to those results. And so Google knows that if they're going to put it that far down, you're less and less likely to get to that content or leverage that content in favor of whatever they put higher up. And so they're putting their own segments there, which are actually stifling competition on the internet, even though a search engine is meant to facilitate a user finding the source of content and then learning from them. Google has now taken steps basically to prevent this standard flow of searching, going to a site that you're looking for that is the expert in that area, to just keep you within their ecosystem. And this is what this individual is referencing here, which is, again, kind of leaning into that monopoly segment and really stifling competition and the environment. And so they aren't necessarily incentivized to give you the best results. They're incentivized to keep as much traffic and as many users for as long as they possibly can, because that puts money into their bank accounts. And so this is where there's somewhat of a conflict of interest, and they're leveraging their authority and power to be able to do this, and have been getting away with this for a number of years.
Content above everyone else.
The government's second major complaint began in 2023, with a focus on online ad technology.
Back almost 20 years now, Google had acquired businesses like DoubleClick to consolidate the entire ad tech ecosystem. If you're a website, you plug into a publisher ad server. If you're an advertiser, you plug into an ad network on the other side, and then you meet on this exchange in the middle. And because Google has maintained, allegedly, a monopoly across each of those properties, it is able to take 20 cents of every dollar that passes through its advertiser exchange. And that is far higher than any other ad exchange on the market because Google really is kind of unavoidable here.
The trial on Google's monopoly power in digital ads began in September 2024 and is slated to run well into 2025. Google is also facing antitrust complaints from other businesses. A notable challenge came from Epic Games, the maker of Fortnite. The problem, Epic claims, is Google was charging a 30% fee on products within apps in its app store.
They were feeling unfairly restricted from accessing consumers directly. Google had gone through many steps to make sure that Epic and other potential app stores were not able to load their own app stores on an Android device. And the case at its core said that if there was actually competition here, you'd see that 30% fee come down significantly. And those savings would probably be passed through to consumers as well.
Attorneys general representing all 50 states also raised this issue with Google in 2021, but Google settled this case with them in 2023. Epic Games also filed a similar complaint against Apple and its App Store.
What have Apple and Google both done? They have said, we want to make money. We want to charge tolls for anyone who wants to cross that bridge to the consumers.
A jury delivered a verdict favoring Epic over Google in 2023, but the company sued again in 2024, claiming that Google continues to use anti-competitive agreements to protect its monopoly power.
Some of those walled gardens, if they haven't entirely come down, have at least come down a little bit. In terms of the Apple ecosystem, they've won some concessions, and that gives them more reason to go after Google and Apple here in the US.
The courts are now determining the best way to restore competition in online industries. Lawyers refer to these solutions as remedies.
Weak remedies would include injunctions that are targeted at specific behaviors that have been identified to be anti-competitive.
For example, the judge in Epic Games versus Google is banning Google from a range of conduct for 3 years. Notably, Google has to let developers charge in-app fees without using Google's billing system, removing the company's ability to levy tolls on its partners and users.
If you move even further into the direction of stricter, more effective remedies, you could, of course, think of structural remedies. Structural remedies include, namely, breakups.
The government is leaving the possibility of a Google breakup open, according to court documents filed in October.
One of the remedies that we're talking about is what it would mean for Google to divest Android. It maintains that separate brand and potential to be independently monetized that could justify separating it from Google and making it a standalone business.
So the most likely scenario is that they break out their ad network. It's their ugly piece of the business. It's about 11% of revenue. This has been long rumored by regulators to get broken out.
But a breakup could be far-fetched.
So I don't think that a breakup is likely, and the market seems to think that way as well. In practice, that would be really, really hard to do because Google is an ecosystem. All of these things are so closely integrated. Even if you broke it up, the different business units would make deals to keep some of that integration. So I think that's really difficult in practice. It's also the most extreme remedy.
Google is expected to appeal the cases, but the company did not respond to CNBC's request for comment. The Google team wrote in a blog post that its ad tech fees are lower than the reported industry averages. The company also wrote that the government's ad tech case could create challenges for small businesses. 69% of them use digital ads to find customers. Google founders Larry Page and Sergey Brin invented the Google search engine in the late 1990s. Their project rose to prominence as Microsoft battled its own antitrust lawsuits in federal court.
So you go back to the Microsoft example of the late 90s, the early 2000s. Microsoft ultimately won that legal battle. If it didn't, it would have been appealed for years and years, but it missed sort of this huge innovation wave. A lot of that had to do with all of its antitrust and legal battles.
But there wasn't a breakup of Microsoft. There was enough of a conduct remedy and a separation of the operating system and the browser to allow for inroads to be made by companies that we now are calling the new illegal monopolies. I mean, this is how Google was able to innovate in its infancy.
This is why all of this antitrust stuff matters. Because if Google is so distracted by these lawsuits, the fear is that it falls behind in this very important race going on right now where the winners are still being decided.
Regulating tech is a bipartisan priority, but some members of Congress disagree with the government's approach.
There's no proof that Google is charging outrageous sums and charging above and controlling the market. They just say they have a lot of the market share. And this has been the problem with antitrust.
So this individual seems to be trying to make a case that Google is not a monopoly. I think one clear example of where this is true, they just highlighted not too long ago, which is the App Store, which is actually due to their own rules that they set themselves. They have prohibited other individuals from making payments through their apps that they all have on the App Store, which is basically the only way you can get apps in those stores. And I think both Google and Apple have done this in the past. And so what that means is if you make an app, which folks find through the App Store, any purchases that a customer makes through that app, Google makes a 30% fee on it, period. And this is where some companies like Amazon, I think, currently are doing experiments where you can browse an app, but then they basically force you into a browser or to another device in order to complete your transaction. That way they don't have to pay Google a 30% fee. And so this is something that Google specifically has enforced. And so this means if you had attempted to put payments into the app, they would just remove you from the App Store, which is, again, basically the only place you can go to get an app onto a user's device. And so in my mind, that's a very clear, cut and dry example of them being a monopoly and abusing their power, which is they're literally telling folks who are using their platform, you are not allowed to make any transactions without us getting a piece of it, period. Even though there's nothing technically preventing you from doing that, that they are going to enforce that on them, and that there's nobody else who can compete on this segment. So they're not allowing other app stores to exist. So they are basically preventing other app stores from existing. They're preventing their users from their customers, in this case being the other companies and the apps, from being able to make transactions with lower prices. And then they can't go to an alternative here because Google is preventing that. So I think that's a pretty clear cut and dry case. I think they're also making the case in a variety of other areas like their ad tech, their search engine, etc. But I think the App Store is a very clear violation of this in my mind, where they are actively stifling the apps themselves and other app stores through their own policies, and they have actively crushed other folks and prevented them from being able to compete with them in this case.
Trust policy going back to Standard Oil.
You know, our foundational antitrust laws were designed at the end of the 19th century, where the monopolies that we were trying to confront back then were railroad barons and steel manufacturers. It is incredible to me that these foundational tools, these antitrust laws, are equally applied to new markets and new and emerging markets. What we're starting to see here is a breadth of enforcement, not just against Google. We now have major antitrust cases pending against Apple, against Amazon, against Meta, against Live Nation Ticketmaster.
Some analysts believe that a breakup, though far-fetched, could possibly be good for the stock.
I think the sum of the parts do unlock value here.
Google has acquired over 200 firms in its nearly 3-decade-long existence. Prominent examples include Android, YouTube, Waze, machine learning pioneer DeepMind, and startup firms that produced services like Google Maps and Docs. That said, Google is in a fierce competition to stay relevant as new technologies like cloud computing and artificial intelligence take hold.
Google is the #3 player in cloud, and cloud is really important in that it's the infrastructure, the back end for generative AI. But there's sort of a new race going on too. Google is very smart in that it's developing its own chips called TPUs that can handle some of the compute power. They still need NVIDIA, they still need GPUs, but they're creating their own technology to enable them to perhaps rely less on an NVIDIA. Amazon's doing a similar thing, so is Microsoft.
Very few companies have the resources to compete for key inputs that drive the production of artificial intelligence tools.
We might run into a situation where the current gatekeepers, the current monopolies, manage to capture that emerging sector simply by extending their power.
They have enormous access to data obtained through their monopoly over the general search engine market.
But the worry is that Google moves a little more slowly than, say, an OpenAI, which adopts more that old Silicon Valley philosophy of move fast and break things. Since ChatGPT arrived and sort of stole that generative AI mainstream moment, you are seeing Google move faster. At the same time, Google has the most to lose. Can Google shift its whole business of search into chatbots with the same success and the same dominance that it's enjoyed over the last few decades?
The coming years could be important for regulators.
The fact of the matter is competition often matters most when there are new inflection points that emerge in the market. Right now is perhaps the most critical inflection point we've seen in the search market in 15 years.
The digital economy in the US has by large remained just unregulated. Antitrust law is kind of the only thing that's happening at all.
The government's battle with big tech companies started while former President Trump was in office. If he were to take office again, the cases are likely to move forward. Democrats are looking for sharper antitrust enforcement too. Vice President Kamala Harris reportedly has a close personal relationship with Google's lead counsel in the case, but she is expected to let the antitrust process run its course.
This could take years because even when we get a decision, Google has already said that they're going to appeal it. There's so many resources that they have to pour into fighting this avalanche of legal battles. And I go back to the Microsoft example from the late 90s, early 2000s. That can sort of erode innovation at the edges for many, many years.
We really need to kind of put our faith in the fact that breaking up monopolies is critical to making sure that that innovation benefits consumers. American people, working families can benefit from that innovation. That's really what this antitrust project holds.
Thank you for watching. And if you enjoyed what you saw, please hit like or subscribe. I'll see you around.